Number 27th. I'm your host, David Michalek, and here with me is John Ulzheimer, formerly with Equifax and FICO. Back again, John. Thank you so much. Glad that you're here and looking forward to having a good live today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And before we get started, I just want to let all the viewers know that yes, I do own more than one shirt. Someone kind of made a wisecrack that I'm always wearing my orange striped shirt with like the blue dolphin logo, and it's just a random thing. I don't know. I guess I like to wear this shirt on Wednesdays, and so. But yes, I in fact own more than one shirt. To anyone who's worried about my wardrobe.
Well, listen, if you're, as long as you're wearing a shirt, it doesn't matter what else, this is you're in your home office. If you're walking around in your underwear, nobody needs to know.
Yes, it could be considerably worse. Trust me.
All right. So, John, we're gonna open up. Everybody watching, this is a live Q&A. So we're gonna talk about credit scores, credit bureaus, whatever you want to talk about. We tend to not touch on the subject of credit repair directly, although you can post the question. I will swing back around and answer it at a later time. But a couple of things, John, I want to talk about, and then we'll just open it up and see where the conversations take us. Can you talk a little bit about suppressed data? Because I had a quick conversation with somebody during the week. I was explaining to him that we don't really see credit reports. We see consumer credit disclosures, which are quite a bit different. But everything that we've ever done, going back since we had any report, any data to report, is on our credit report. It's just not visible. It's not visible for a variety of reasons. So I thought maybe you might explain that, maybe a little bit more in depth, the difference between a consumer credit disclosure, which we all call a credit report, and what a credit report really is.
Yeah, that's actually a really good topic. The precision in the wording is important and it's meaningful. So I think people generally just kind of refer to that thing that we get from Equifax periodically as a credit report, and also that thing that Wells Fargo buys from Equifax periodically as a credit report, and that thing that your mortgage lender gets is a credit report. So the term that is kind of used universally to describe all of the things that Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion sell or give away are credit reports, which is fine for casual discussions. But if you want to be more precise in your wording, then we should talk about the differences between different types of reports that these consumer reporting agencies are providing. So this is the easiest way to think about it. So if you have a bucket, and in the bucket, you're going to stick these reports. One of the buckets is for consumers, and the other bucket is for everybody else. So the bucket for consumers, which is going to include the credit reports you can buy off the internet, the credit reports that you can pull for free off of annualcreditreport.com. Those are generally referred to as credit reports. However, especially as it pertains to the reports that you can get from annualcreditreport.com, those are referred to as consumer disclosures. And the reason they're called consumer disclosures is because in the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there is language that's been there for 20 years. It's actually been there since 2003, that gives the consumer a right to disclosure of their credit report information. So that report that's provided through annualcreditreport.com, which exists because of a 2003 amendment to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, is called a consumer disclosure because it fits the requirement or satisfies the requirement of the credit bureaus to give consumers access to their data once every 12 months. We know that the credit bureaus have changed their policy in that respect, and actually just last week announced that they're going to make permanent the ability for consumers to get copies of those disclosure credit reports from annualcreditreport.com as often as once a week. So 52 times a year times 3 credit bureaus is which is great and is permanent. So before, they've done this twice. When COVID hit, they announced you'd be able to get credit reports weekly until the end of the year, and then they re-upped, and it was through the end of this year. And now they've said, you know what, we're just going to make it permanent. And so now forever, you can get free copies of your disclosure style credit reports every week from all 3 credit bureaus. And so that's where you'll hear me use words like credit report disclosure, and that's intentional. the reports that your banks get or that your credit card issuers get for underwriting purposes are generally referred to as credit reports. Those are the reports that are used for risk assessment, for marketing, for collection purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they have much of the same information, they're definitely not redundant, meaning that they're not identical carbon copies of each other. And they're certainly not in the same format. The reports that you can pull off the internet obviously are designed for you to understand and be able to navigate. And the reports that are sold to, say, Wells Fargo or Citibank are actually in code. And unless you understand the code, you wouldn't have a clue what you're looking at, even though it's very similar. The data is similar than what you would see off of a report that you'd pull off of the internet. So that's generally what the difference between the two. I think the topic that you wanted to talk about was data suppression and what is suppressed data. So data suppression.
Before we do that, let's just put a real quick comment there because that's going to be a really good subject. Let's go to Ronald right here. He's got a great question. Can a creditor show the same charge off every month?
Yes, they can. Actually, there was a series of lawsuits on this very topic several years ago. I called it the rolling L. Whenever I see lawyers suing under the same theory, I give it a name because I know these guys all talk to each other and kind of test different lawsuit theories. And this one I called the rolling L, like the letter L. In credit reporting, in Metro 2, in the credit reporting language, the L is the code that represents charge off. And so what you would see on some trade lines is, let's say hypothetically, Ronald, that some person had a charged off credit card and it was charged off in January of 2020. So you would see the charge off notation in the payment history profile, or that 84-month grid that you sometimes see, that two-dimensional grid that you see on a credit report. And then every single month from January of 2020 through January of 2021 through January of 2022, 23, etc., you'd see charge off, in every single month. And the theory that these plaintiffs' attorneys had was, an unsophisticated user of credit reports might think that these are 55 charge-offs on a credit report because it shows up for 55 consecutive months. And credit scoring systems must be interpreting these as being dozens and dozens of charge-offs instead of just one charge. Of course, none of that's actually true. That's just kind of the theory that they were trying to push until it was roundly disproven. But as long as the and remember, a charge off, we kind of throw around the term charge off without really understanding what it means. The full formal term to a charge off is called a profit and loss charge off, or profit and loss charged off to profit and loss, or some reasonable derivative of that phrase. And essentially, what that means is the creditor has concluded that they're not going to get paid, and so they're going to. It's essentially an accounting maneuver. And they're going to move that from a performing account to a loss. And they're going to essentially take a loss on that because they're not going to get paid. And it's really more for accounting than it is for anything else. But on a credit report, it's either represented as a charge-off or a profit and loss charge-off. And it's really the same thing. And so, yes, as long as every single month on the payment history profile, the account was still in a charged-off status, then that's what that grid is meant to represent. What was the status of this account in that particular month? And if it was charged off 3 years ago and it's still charged off today and it's been charged off for every single month in between, then yes, you can show it on a credit report as being charged off for every single one of those months. And so two things. Number one, no, it's not interpreted by credit scoring models as being multiple charge-offs. That's number one. Number two is it's not interpreted as being more recent of a charge-off, even though it was reported last month as being a charge-off. Credit scoring systems are not dumb. They can see the date that the account first went delinquent that led to the charge-off, and that's the date that is used to determine the age of the delinquency.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ronald. And I've gotten this one a lot because people think every single month they're updating this as a brand new charge-off. And that's not the case. It's just as John said, all it's doing is saying that the account is the same this month as it was the month before and the month before and the month before. And you're not getting dinged every month for that. In fact, you're recovering the more time you're putting between yourself and that initial charge off collection charge off classification, you are in a state of recovery, providing you're doing everything else right and you're not also doing high risk things to hurt your credit, in addition to the charge off that already took place.
Actually, that's a really good question, because I see, unfortunately, Ronald, I think a lot of the stuff that you see on the internet, and I realize that's a little hypocritical because we're on the internet right now. I think a lot of the stuff you see on the web with respect to that kind of stuff is wrong. And so you'll see people talk about how, oh my God, this really is 15 charge offs because it shows up 15 times on one account. And really, it's at the account level, not at the month level. And so once an account is charged off, that's it. It doesn't. It's very unusual that it is no longer a charge off the following month. Even if you pay it or settle it, it becomes a paid charge off or a settled charge off. And then, of course, your balance would go to zero, but the account was still charged off. It doesn't go from being charged off to all of a sudden it's in good standing just because you paid it or just because you settled it. It's still charged off. It's just there's just no balance associated with it any longer, which I think dovetails nicely into the next question from David. That's our Grace that's coming up.
Yeah. Can you please advise? I have a closed charge-off account with American Express that should fall off by March of next year. Should I settle it or just allow it to fall off next year? And the second part of that question is, I'm just scared of paying it off, and they reset the clock on me. Okay.
So she asked you. I'm happy to take it if you want me to.
Well, I'll give you. So I think John and I are going to have very much the same opinion on this, Grace, is that if you have a debt where you sign on the line that is dotted that you agreed to pay it, to, if you can settle that debt, that's the right thing to do. I mean, it's a debt that you owed and that you incurred. And if you can settle that, that's ideally what you should do. And then, John, I'll let you take the second part of the question.
Yeah. So, Grace, I think, look, I understand your concern about you've lived with this thing on your credit report for, well, over 6 years if you're looking at next March as being the date that it's coming off. And also, Grace, if you're watching, can you just verify, is March the 7-year anniversary of you missing the first payment, or is that a different anniversary? And then I'm asking for a reason. So if you could answer that in the comment section while I'm answering the other part of your question, that would be great, because I want to add one thing to my answer. So here's the deal. So the 7-year clock, and the credit bureaus call it the obsolescence clock. Some people call it the delete from or the purge date. It means the same thing regardless of what term you're using. Charge-offs can only remain for a fixed period of time. So you can call Amex, you can dispute the account, you can pay the account in full, or you can settle the account. And none of those things can cause the initial date of delinquency to become more recent. And that's the only reason your quote-unquote clock reset, and therefore cause the item to remain longer than the 7 years it's allowed. In fact, and trust me, and Amex is a very sophisticated lender. It's very unusual that you'll hear Amex doing something like re-aging. You hear that more in the context of debt collectors, and even in that scenario, it's very, very uncommon that I see legitimate re-aging occur on a collection account. The only way that it could screw you up is if Amex improperly changed that date of first delinquency to something more recent. And that's, number one, that's re-aging, and that's not legal because you can't change that date. But that would be the only thing that would reset the clock. I think sometimes people confuse the credit reporting clock with the time bar debt clock. And
yeah, very much so.
Yeah, with the time bar debt rules, meaning that how long can a creditor sue you to collect a debt? Once that period of time, and that period of time varies from like 3 years to I think all the way up to 15 years, and it's based on the state where the contract is written that you signed with your creditor. In that scenario, the answer is yes. If you make a payment, or even some scenarios, if you commit to make a payment, then you may restart the clock. But that doesn't have anything to do with credit reporting. That has to do with whether or not the creditor can sue you to collect the debt. So that you're right to be concerned from a time bar debt perspective, but you're okay from a credit reporting perspective. And so, okay, so you answered the question below. I asked if March of next year represented 7 years from the date that the account first went delinquent, and you verified that yes, March makes it 7 years from the first delinquency or the date of first delinquency. So I'm gonna make you really happy this evening. The credit reporting agencies for the last 3+ decades have deleted things at 6 years and 9 months, not 7 years. So even though they're allowed to maintain that stuff for a full 7 years, that's what the Fair Credit Reporting Act clearly allows them to do. As a matter of policy, the bureaus delete at 6 years. And this is not a secret. You can validate this. I'm pretty sure there's articles written about the 6 years and 9 months that deletion rather than 7 years. And so even though March might be 7 years from the date of first delinquency, it's highly likely that that account is going to be deleted either in December of this year or January of next year. So it's actually going to come off earlier than you think it's going to come off, assuming that 7 years really is from some date in March in 2017, because that would be 7 years from March of 2024. So congratulations. So logging on tonight, you just learned you're going to get off the hook 3 months early.
Scott, good to see you, Scott. Welcome back. Why would a creditor change the status from charge off to open after a dispute letter? I've never seen that. Change the status of charge off account to open?
Yeah, that doesn't. So they're two different things, right? I mean, the one really isn't a substitute for the other. One is an account status, and the other indicates whether or not the account is usable or not. And normally not normally, always, when an account is charged off, it is closed. It's actually been probably closed for quite some time. It's been closed for further usage because the creditor obviously doesn't want you to get into any more debt because you're not paying them. So it's interesting. There's more than one way to report a charge off. So there's those L codes that I talked about a minute ago, David. There's also an account status code 97 that indicates something is charged off. So it would be, it probably still indicates that the account is charged off, but it may also, for some odd reason, indicate that it's open. There's another possibility. There's a portfolio type in credit reporting where it designates what type of account it is. So I for installment, R for revolving, and O for open. And open in this context does not mean the opposite of closed. It just means that payment in full is due upon demand, kind of like your utilities, kind of like like the Amex Green charge card, and also collections. So there's also a possibility that it could be reporting as an open portfolio type, depending on what type of account it is.
It's an auto repo.
Say again?
It's an auto repo from Toyota. So I still think it's usually closed charge-off status with whatever balance is from the deficiency.
Yeah.
So it'll usually have a deficiency balance if it went to auction, which is pretty common.
It depends on the state. There's some states where they can't, where the state law extinguishes the deficiency balance, and some states they can come after you. And in the states where it does, there's actually a relatively new code in credit reporting that indicates debt extinguished due to state law, because there are some states where that's a real thing.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. In status section of Credit Versio report. Actually, that'd be your smart credit report or your identity IQ report. Yeah, Scott, I'd be curious to see it. That'd be kind of unique for it to have it open back up after it's been charged off. Maybe somebody made a mistake. Okay. All right. There's no other questions. I think we're all caught up. John, you're about to jump in.
You want me to get back to the suppression thing?
Yeah, let's get back to the suppression thing.
I don't think I ever actually answered that. All right. So and I assume you were asking about You're not asking about what the CFPB is all upset about right now, about how credit card issuers are suppressing the minimum payment made on accounts. They're calling
No,
that data suppression. Okay.
no.
So
We're talking about accounts that get suppressed
yeah,
under certain circumstances.
yeah. So there are scenarios where if something is removed from your credit report, it truly is deleted, which means it's gone. And then there are other scenarios where the item is suppressed or masked, and some people call it cloaking. And essentially, what that means is the item is still in the credit file database associated with you. However, there's coding on the item which will prevent it from ever showing up on your credit report again. So I use the old-fashioned. So for those of you who are old enough that you used like correction tape on a typewriter or whiteout. Remember the old whiteout where you'd like dab the liquid whiteout on something and then it would dry and you'd write over the, obviously no one does that anymore, but that's like suppression. It's like white it out. It's still there. You just can't see it. So when you pull your own credit report, you're not going to see it because it's suppressed. When a lender pulls your credit report, they're not going to see it because it's suppressed. And a credit scoring system is also not going to see it because it's suppressed. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why would you suppress something versus just delete something? That's a fair and a very good question. So when you delete something from a credit report, it leaves a hole for the item to be re-reported. So there's essentially an empty spot just waiting for the item to be re-reported by the data furnisher. When something is suppressed, that hole is still filled with the item, and so it can't be accidentally re-reported by the creditor. And so normally suppression is something that occurs when fraud happens. Is say someone opened an account in your name and it was fraudulently opened and the credit bureaus suppressed it. That would prevent the lender from accidentally re-reporting it the next month. So that's the value of suppression versus, say, for example, you dispute an account on your credit report. The creditor doesn't get back to the credit bureaus in 30 days. The credit bureaus delete it because it's not a verifiable account. And then 35 days later, instead of 30 days later, the creditors verify it or re-report it. And so in those scenarios, it would be re-reported to the credit report because number one, it's not suppressed. And number two, as long as the furnisher is comfortable that they're reporting something that's accurate, they can certainly re-report it.
Excellent. Good question from Broken Famous. So,
Okay.
while using Credit Versio, I would ever have to include consumer law from the FCRA myself to dispute item on my credit report as a late and delinquent payment. So, question is, wanting to throw in. We talk about this a lot, John. The downside of putting quoting laws inside dispute letters. So, John, having worked in dispute resolution for Equifax, I can't think of anybody better to answer that one.
Yeah, look. You get to write. You're a grown up, and grown ups get to do grown up things and make grown up decisions. And you can write whatever letter you want to write to the credit reporting agencies. Most of those letters are read by people who do not have law degrees, and so they're not going to understand what 1681E2SB subsection blah blah blah. They don't know what that is, right? Because that's not what they've been trained to do. That's number one. Number two, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion know their obligations under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's no benefit to reminding them. Your letter isn't all of a sudden more important just because you've quoted the FCRA. And in some scenarios, it could backfire because all three of the credit reporting agencies are on the lookout for frivolous dispute letters. And one of the ways they can identify, and this goes back to before I was working for Equifax. So we're talking about in the last century. And one of the ways they can identify frivolous dispute letters is consumers who have an amazing understanding of the Fair Credit Reporting Act who are not lawyers. Because if you read a lot of these template letters you can buy off the internet, they are loaded with references to case law and references to the FDCPA and references to the FCRA. So I don't know that you're going to cause them to take your letter any more seriously, but you could accidentally cause them to think that you've paid some credit repair company $129 a month to just bury them with dispute letters, which obviously is not. It gives them, it puts them in a position where they can ignore your letter because they could reasonably interpret it as being frivolous. So that's just my 2 cents. But again, people can write whatever letters they want to write to the credit bureaus.
Yeah, one of the things that we for Broken Famous, just expanding on that answer a little bit. One of the things that we've done internally is we can look at the success rate of people who are using Credit Versio as far as, and we can interpret the success rate as how serious are the bureaus taking these letters. And it was very intentional, the style of letter that the software produces. It's meant to be something that you would just write yourself. If you were posing an objection or a query to the bureaus, if you look at what Credit Versio is putting together, it's 2 or 3 lines. It's not complicated. If you had a legitimate dispute and you were sitting down and you wanted to put something together to open an investigation with the bureau, it would look exactly like what Credit Versio produces. And we know for a fact, and coming from the credit repair space, 11 plus years, is when you start loading these letters with "this is the law and I demand that you do this and these are the consequences, this is the case law," it's just not going to go well. And we have internal data from partners that license our software that are in the credit repair space that do send letters on behalf of their clients, that they're not quoting laws because they're effectively sending the same letter, but the fact that they're coming from a credit repair company, we can watch their success stats go down because it's coming from a third party. So anything that you do that's going to flag your letter as potentially coming from a credit repair company, there might be a price to pay. So just leave it as is. I mean, you can do what you want, but my advice is just leave it as is. Simple is better. Let's see. Curtis with a question. Is it best to pay off cars before proceeding with a mortgage application? If so, for debt to income ratio, will this decrease credit score due to the length of account? That's a good question.
It's a very good question. So Curtis, here's my 2 cents on this issue. If you're going to pay off, first off, if you're going to choose to pay off a car loan or multiple car loans, then do it because it'll help your debt to income ratio and help you qualify for either the mortgage that you're looking for or a larger amount of money than you're looking for. That's really the benefit of paying off installment debt. Let's just say your payment on your car loan is $1,000 or your car loans is $2,000. I'm just making up some numbers here. Obviously, that number is considered in your debt to income ratio, and having those monthly obligations can be held against you. There's another thing that you also might want to do. You might want to talk to your mortgage broker before you start writing big checks to auto lenders. If you look at, and I don't expect anybody would because it's 1,600 pages. The Fannie and Freddie selling guides. You may want to ask your mortgage broker. First off, talk to one that's experienced. Don't talk to a guy that's been working there for a month. Talk to an experienced mortgage broker and ask them if your auto loans are considered in debt to income ratio calculations. Because depending on how long you have left on your loan, the monthly payment may already be excluded from their calculation of the debt to income ratio. So you may not have to pay off your auto loans in order to help your debt to income ratio because the auto loans may already be ignored by because of the Fannie or Freddie selling guide policy. So ask your mortgage broker if your loans are being considered in DTI or if they're close enough to getting paid off that they're being ignored in DTI. So that's number one. Number two, if they are being considered in DTI, meaning that there's a long enough amount left on them that they are going to count those payments, then yes, obviously paying off the car loans is going to lower your debt to income ratio and make it easier for you to qualify for a larger amount of money for your mortgage loan, but it's not going to help your credit score. And the reason it's not going to help your credit score is because installment debt is almost entirely benign to your credit score. And it actually might lower your credit score. And you're probably wondering why in the world would this lower my credit score? There is a fairly it's flown under the radar for a really long time, and the only time it pops up is when someone does what you're contemplating and their score goes down, and all of a sudden they start asking questions about what happened. FICO's scoring systems actually reward you for recent activity on installment debts. And if you pay off your auto loans, there is no more recent activity on installment debts because your balances are now zero. So there's a possibility that your scores might actually go down because of you paying off your auto loan. So so number one, Kurt, thank you very much for asking this question before you just went and did it and assumed that it was just going to be helpful and there's no way in the world that would hurt you, and you have to do it in order to qualify, because none of that stuff may actually be true. You may not have to do it. It might actually lower your score, and you may qualify for the loan you're looking for even while you still have the auto loan debt, which means you can keep your powder dry and maybe pay more down on your mortgage loan and lower your monthly payment there.
Excellent. Yeah, Curtis. When I turned my lease in, or turned my car in on a lease about 3 years ago, and there was a little bit of a drop. It wasn't substantial, maybe 20 points or something like that. But I mean, if you're 20 points, 30 points away from qualifying to that next tier, that best interest rate, then maybe that's something to consider. If that if you pay off that loan, and if the loan is being considered in your DTI.
Hey, Curtis, do me a favor. So I don't think I have the ability to put links on this in this forum. Google, why did my FICO score go down after I paid off my loan? And look, I know that there's at least one article on FICO's website that if you word your search term good enough, you'll find the article. And it's actually on FICO's website. It's not just about FICO, it's written by FICO. And they do a pretty good job of explaining exactly what I just said, which is that you're rewarded for having recent activity on installment loans, which is why having installment loans, especially those that have low balances relative to the original loan amount, is actually pretty helpful to your scores. So you may find the article on their website.
David Fenton's back. Good to see you. If I pay off a debt collector, what happens to the original debt?
Awesome. So the inner workings of actually the relationship between a debt collector and the original creditor. So David, I'm going to assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to assume, sir, that the original creditor just assigned the debt to the third-party debt collector and didn't buy the debt from the original creditor. Because if they bought the debt, then the original creditor is out of the picture. They've already been paid for the debt, and they're no longer in the picture anymore. And the debt collector, aka debt or / debt buyer, is now the new creditor. So, but in the scenario that I think you're talking about, which is there's just an assignment of the debt. Let me throw some numbers out just to make the math easy. So let's say that you had, not you in particular, but a consumer had a defaulted apartment lease of $1,000. And the apartment complex hires a debt collector to collect the $1,000 from the former tenant of the apartment complex. Okay, so the debt collector has an agreement with the original creditor, which is probably a property management company in this scenario, and that agreement defines how much the debt collector is going to get paid if they're able to collect that debt from the consumer. And it's usually in the neighborhood of between 30 to 40% of the debt. So if in that scenario you owed $1,000, the debt collector starts asking for the money, you pay the debt collector $1,000, they're going to keep 30 to 40% of it, depending on their arrangement with the property management company, and then they're going to pay the rest of it back to the property management company. So that's usually what happens with the original creditors. They get a smaller portion back than what they were entitled to originally, but at least they got something and they can worry about managing property instead of trying to collect debts. Usually the debt collector has some degree of flexibility with respect to agreeing to settlements. And so if they're trying to collect $1,000, the original creditor may have told them, hey, look, try to collect 1,000. That's how much they owe us. If you collect 500, we'll be happy. So they've given them tolerance to cut a deal with the consumer to try to get them to pay something. And so that's why you'll hear sometimes debt collectors say, hey, look, you owe 1,000. We're running a special. If you pay us 800, you'll never hear from us again. So that's what they're doing, is they know that they've got some flexibility with respect to what they're supposed to collect. And so again, yes, they get to keep a portion of it, and the rest of it goes back to the original creditor. And if you do pay it or settle it, just make sure that it's updated on your credit report to indicate that it now has a zero balance.
Yeah. So David put a little bit more content on it. Original creditor Synchrony, now it's owned by Portfolio. So now we're talking about a debt buyer, not a company that is assigned debt.
Yeah, so I think Portfolio, I think you're referring to PRA, Portfolio Recovery Associates.
Yeah. Right.
So if Portfolio bought the debt from Synchrony Bank, here's likely what happens. So Synchrony has, a gajillion different retail partners, right? So if you have an account with this company or that company, you really have an account with Synchrony Bank. And the other one is Comenity Bank. They have a lot of those retail relationships. So obviously a lot of consumers default on those types of relationships. And so what will happen is these lenders will bulk all of that defaulted debt and then sell it. So let's say they may sell, $100 million of defaulted debt to a debt buyer for, $7 million. And so that's 7 cents on the dollar. And now the debt buyer becomes the new creditor, right? So even though you've never heard of this company, believe it or not, you have a relationship with them now, whether you want to or not. And then they're going to try to collect the amount that you owe because they have the contractual rights to do so.
Yeah, so David, usually when you have a charge-off account, say with Synchrony using that example, what's supposed to happen is it goes to a zero balance, and then that balance is now absorbed by, in this case, Portfolio. So when you pay off Portfolio, it doesn't change anything with the original creditor. That's essentially effectively a debt account. It's a closed charge-off account.
Yeah, it's in what in credit reporting nomenclature refers to as a finalized status. The Synchrony account in your example, David, is in a finalized status. And so it was probably charged off because they're not going to sell debt that's in good standing to a debt buyer. So it's probably charged off, which means it's in a finalized status, which means it was updated one last time right before they sold it. And there's probably some language on the credit report that indicates account transferred or sold. And the balance should be zero because they've been paid by the debt buyer for that outstanding debt. And so you don't owe the original creditor any more debt. And even if you tried to pay them, they wouldn't accept it because you don't owe them any money. You now owe Portfolio, or the consumer in this scenario now owns the debt buyer that money. And they can try to collect 100% of what you owe. Even though they didn't pay 100% of what you owed, they can certainly try to collect 100% of what you owe because that's how much you owe. You don't owe what they paid for the debt. You owe the whole amount. And so that's why when you hear David and I do these lives, and if you've ever heard me speak in person, or if you've ever seen any of my a gajillion videos that are on the internet over the past three decades, you've never ever heard me ever say, don't pay your creditors. You've never heard me say that, ever. But you have heard me say, once a debt buyer buys a debt from an original creditor, you should try to settle it because the debt buyer doesn't have the same amount of skin in the game as the original creditor has.
Yeah.
So to the extent you're not going to pay the original creditor, fine. Let's flip the page and go to the next chapter. The debt buyer, now you should try to negotiate a settlement because they've invested a small amount to buy your debt. And even if you pay them half of what you owe or 75% of what you owe, it's still considerably more than what they paid for your debt. And so they're making a lot of margin on that particular debt, which is why I feel comfortable advising consumers to at least try to settle those versus paying them in full.
Let's see. Okay. So why don't we wrap up with this? We got you about for maybe a couple more minutes there, John, and then I know you got to take off. Let's finish up with, it's still on David's question, the positive aspects of settling a collection, because there's a lot of chatter out there. Don't pay your collections. Don't talk to collection companies. Bad advice. I know. We've even had people, one or two times, like, want to argue with us on this live, like, no, you're not obligated to pay your collections. But as far as the gravity of that effect on credit scoring, maybe you can talk a little bit about the benefits that take place once you settle a debt with a collection company.
Saying you don't have an obligation to pay what you owe and believing that, that's very troubling. I'm just glad I'm not a lender, I guess, for some people who think like that. That should be a question on an application. Do you believe that you should pay your lender or anyone trying to collect a valid debt? And if you say no, right, then automatic decline, not doing business with you.
It's a prevailing opinion out there, unfortunately, that because this is a third party and there's no relationship, that, well, I don't have an obligation to pay this company that I've never heard of, even though they bought the debt. It's an asset.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously that's wrong. But
it's wrong. Yeah. But I wasn't arguing whether it was.
I'm not going to get in an argument and try to change someone's mind who's standing in front of a Lamborghini they don't own, in front of a house where they don't live, trying to sell something. All right. So exactly. Here's the benefit of paying or settling collections. Number one, you're not going to get sued, right? So let's say that you do follow some of this crazy advice and you ignore your debt collectors and you never answer your phone when they call and you run their letters through shredders and I will not engage with the debt collector because of something I saw on the internet. And then you get a knock on your door, and then there's a friendly guy standing there with his phone recording the interaction with you, and he hands you a lawsuit, a complaint from either the creditor or the debt collector or the debt buyer, because now you're being sued, and they're going to now use the law and legal means to collect the debt. Try ignoring that one because you can't. Because if you have 30 days to respond to that. And the reason they recorded you is now you can't say that you didn't get it because he has it on video that he handed it to you. So now you have to go hire a lawyer. That's going to nail you for, clip you for $300 or $400 an hour. And you're going to have to, you really want to go to court and fight a debt that you actually owe? And that's going to cost you thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, a lot of sleepless nights worrying about this. So it doesn't make sense in my mind to ignore your collectors because you're just giving them an incentive to sue you. And the larger the amount that you owe them, the more, the better return on investment it is for them to sue you. And if you ignore them and you throw that paperwork in the garbage and pretend like it didn't just happen, then they're going to win by default. They're going to get what's called a default judgment. Because the process still continues even if you're choosing to not engage in the process. So now you have a default judgment against you. And now they can do things like, writ of sequestration or AKA garnishing your wages. These are things that now you can't ignore because now they're forced upon you versus you working with the debt collector originally, trying to come to some sort of amicable agreement on how to deal with this debt and then being done with it. So settling the debt and working with the debt collector, number one, it prevents the lawsuit. Number two, it stops the phone calls and stops the letters. Number three, the credit reporting is still not great, but at least it has a zero balance and it doesn't indicate that you still owe some amount of money. And just it closes the chapter of it closes an unpleasant chapter in a book and allows you to put it behind you and not think about it any longer, versus ignoring it and there's another phone call, ignoring it and there's another phone call, and here's a letter, and oh, by the way, now I'm getting sued because I'm not paying it. Yeah. There's just nothing good that comes out of ignoring your debt collector.
Yeah. All right, John. Great questions today. Thank you very much for some fantastic answers. Looks like everybody really appreciates the information that they got. And I want to thank everybody for asking the questions that they did. Really good, engaging questions. And then we'll wrap it up for today. If anybody sees this on a replay, or if you post a question and I just missed it, I'll swing back around and answer it on Facebook and on YouTube. John, thanks again. Safe travels. Have fun in San Francisco. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, David. Y'all have a good night.